April 7, 1994 begins like any ordinary day over Memphis. Clear skies stretching above the airport. Calm air promising a routine departure for a Federal Express DC-10 freighter lifting off toward San Jose, yet within minutes this ordinary flight will become one of the most violent and extraordinary survival stories in aviation history. A battle fought inside a cockpit in the air at impossible speeds, with 3 men bleeding and broken fighting to keep a cargo plane from becoming a weapon. At around 3:30 p.m., the aircraft suddenly tilts upward, rolls sharply left, and accelerates into a steep dive, airspeed climbing beyond 860 kilometers per hour, faster than a DC-10 was ever meant to fly. The airframe shuddering under forces it was never designed to withstand. And in the middle of this chaos, a calm but strained voice cuts through air traffic control, declaring an emergency, reporting an attempted takeover on board, requesting immediate vectors back to Memphis, as 3 crew members fight for their lives against a man determined to turn their aircraft into a missile. Federal Express Flight 705 is not carrying passengers. Only cargo, and its crew is small, a captain, a first officer, and a flight engineer. But on this day, a 4th FedEx employee is on board, a man named Auburn Callaway, traveling as a deadhead passenger, quiet and unremarkable, carrying a travel bag and a guitar case. Boarding first unnoticed, blending into a routine that thousands of employees used every day, and no one suspects that inside that guitar case are hammers and a spear gun. Callaway was supposed to work this flight as flight engineer, but scheduling rules changed at the last moment. Another crew was assigned, and he boarded anyway, sitting just outside the cockpit, where the replacement flight engineer Andrew Peterson casually notices the cockpit voice recorder switched off, flips it back on, and thinks nothing more of it, while Captain David Sanders and First Officer James Tucker finish their pre-flight checks, greet Callaway and depart Memphis under clear skies, unaware that the door behind them has not been locked and that the man sitting just outside is moments away from attacking. 26 minutes after takeoff, climbing through 18,000 feet, the routine hum of flight is shattered as Callaway opens his guitar case, loads the spear gun, grips 2 hammers, and without warning steps into the cockpit and begins striking hammer blows, landing on Peterson from behind, then on Tucker as he turns, then on Captain Sanders as he tries to defend himself, steel crashing against bone in a confined space filled with alarms and confusion, blood spraying across panels, the aircraft still climbing, autopilot engaged, while 3 men are suddenly fighting for survival. Peterson's temporal artery is severed, blood pouring rapidly. Tucker's skull is fractured, bone fragments piercing his brain and paralyzing the right side of his body. Sanders' ear nearly torn away, deep gashes across his head. All 3 disoriented, in agony, yet somehow still conscious, and when Callaway steps back toward the galley to retrieve the spear gun, those few seconds become their only chance to resist. Sanders unbuckling, stumbling toward the door, Peterson and Tucker dragging themselves upright, refusing to accept that this is how they will die. Callaway returns, spear gun raised, ordering Sanders back into his seat, declaring the weapon real and deadly. But Peterson lunges forward, grabbing the spear before the trigger can be pulled, Sanders rushing in to help. Tucker realizing the attacker is momentarily off balance. And in that instant, Tucker pulls the yoke back hard, pitching the DC-10 upward into a steep climb that throws all of them into the galley. Bodies colliding with walls and ceiling, gravity shifting violently, as the aircraft becomes a weapon not against the crew but against the attacker. Tucker, a former Navy fighter pilot, now treats the situation as aerial combat, rolling the DC-10 left by 140 degrees, nearly inverting the aircraft, the galley becoming the ceiling, men fighting upside down, blood floating in weightless arcs. Callaway struggling to keep hold of his weapon, Sanders and Peterson weakening with every second of blood loss, while Tucker fights the controls with one functioning side of his body, determined to keep the attacker off balance. But this maneuver comes at a cost. Injuries worsen, and Callaway manages to land more blows, pushing his advantage until Tucker, half paralyzed, commits to a desperate move, sending the DC-10 into a vertical nosedive, speed increasing beyond design limits, cockpit panels shaking, control surfaces vibrating violently, the aircraft screaming through the air at over 860 kilometers per hour, and if Tucker pulls out too fast the wings could fail. If he waits too long the plane will hit the ground, and in the galley, Sanders and Peterson cling to life, fighting on pure adrenaline against a man who will not stop. As the dive stabilizes, Sanders finally wrests a hammer away and strikes Callaway, giving just enough opening for Tucker to radio Memphis, his voice strained, declaring an emergency. Reporting an attempted takeover, demanding vectors back home, and those words trigger the highest level of airport response. Emergency crews, SWAT teams, ambulances, all racing into position, while controllers guide the wounded pilot back toward the airport, unsure if the crew is still alive, hearing only noise and struggle in the background. Inside the aircraft, Tucker continues violent rolls left and right, trying to surprise Callaway, to weaken him, to create opportunities for Sanders and Peterson to strike, and slowly, painfully, they begin to overpower the attacker, pinning him down, controlling the spear gun, stripping away his weapons, but the cost is enormous, blood everywhere, movement slowing, strength fading, and still the aircraft must be landed. Sanders returns to the cockpit, taking the controls, while Tucker drags himself to the galley, stunned by the devastation, seeing his crew covered in blood. Callaway pinned to the floor, and with shaking hands Sanders radios Memphis again, declaring an emergency landing, requesting security to meet the aircraft, warning that they will stop on the runway. And on the ground, every response unit prepares for an aircraft that might crash, burn, or explode on arrival. The DC-10 is now dangerously overweight, full of fuel, unable to dump it because Sanders cannot safely reach the switches, meaning landing risks tire explosion and structural collapse, and worse, Callaway is still struggling in the galley, forcing Sanders into an impossible decision, leaving the cockpit to finish the attacker or stay at the controls and risk losing everything. And for a moment he places the aircraft on autopilot and moves to end the threat, but Tucker has already pinned Callaway again, sparing Sanders from killing him, yet costing precious time as the aircraft flies away from the ideal approach path. Now Sanders must improvise, choosing a longer runway at a difficult angle, requiring sharp turns, rapid descent, and a flawless touchdown, all while injured, bleeding, jaw dislocated, ear hanging loose, ignoring warning systems screaming across the dashboard, while in the galley Peterson, barely conscious from blood loss, sees Callaway reaching for one last hammer, and with the final reserve of his strength strikes him, stunning him permanently, ending the fight. Moments later the DC-10 touches down, overweight, overspeed, tires screaming against runway, yet somehow holding, slowing to a stop with only a few hundred meters to spare. And when emergency teams reach the aircraft, the first sight they see is Auburn Callaway in handcuffs. The crew slumped and broken but alive, a catastrophe averted by willpower alone. Peterson is carried out first, barely a pulse. Tucker follows with a fractured skull and brain injury, Sanders walking only with help, and all three are rushed to hospital, while Callaway is restrained on a stretcher, the plan that almost destroyed them all finally over, and the question remains, why did he do it? Auburn Callaway once had a promising life, studying at Stanford, becoming a Navy pilot, building a family, but after leaving the military, he joined FedEx as a flight engineer, a job he believed was beneath his qualifications, a career that left him bitter, divorced, struggling financially, still trying to support his children. And when FedEx discovered he had exaggerated flight hours on his resume, he faced disciplinary action, convinced his career was over and his ability to provide for his children gone. In desperation, he formed a chilling plan, knowing that as a FedEx employee dying in a work-related accident, his family would receive a multi-million-dollar life insurance payout, and he decided that crashing a company aircraft, while dying in the process, would secure his children's future. A twisted calculation that led him to pack hammers, a spear gun, and a knife to board Flight 705, to kill the crew, seize the controls, and end everything in a fiery impact that would appear accidental. But a minor scheduling change forced him into a passenger seat instead of the cockpit, turning his plan from calculated to chaotic, requiring him to fight 3 trained aviators instead of 2, a difference that would save countless lives. And on the morning of the flight, he left a final note for his ex-wife, speaking of choosing his own time, place, and method to go, stepping onto the aircraft believing he would never leave it alive. What followed was a feat of human endurance rarely seen. 3 men, shattered bones, torn flesh, partial paralysis, still flying a crippled aircraft through extreme maneuvers, still fighting a determined attacker, still bringing a heavy jet safely to ground, and Tucker would need years of surgery and therapy to walk and speak again. Sanders and Peterson would never fly professionally again. But they survived, formed lifelong bonds, and received the highest civilian aviation honor for heroism. Callaway was convicted of attempted aircraft piracy, sentenced to consecutive life terms without parole, his plan to be remembered as a tragic provider replaced by the reality of a failed mass murder attempt. and investigators later concluded he likely intended to crash the aircraft into FedEx headquarters in Memphis, multiplying the destruction, a disaster narrowly avoided by a crew that refused to surrender. A single scheduling rule, a single minute of overtime that reassigned a crew, altered history, placing Callaway against three men who would not break. And because of their courage, one of the most devastating aviation catastrophes ever conceived ended instead as a story of survival, sacrifice, and impossible control in the face of madness. If stories of human endurance, aviation disasters, and real-world survival under pressure fascinate you, share your thoughts on what you believe kept this crew fighting when everything said they should have failed, and join the discussion below.